Grace to you and peace on this beautiful Lord's Day morning. It is good to be with you. If you have attempted to watch this video on Saturday night, you will have been disappointed, I suppose, given the fact that it is early Sunday morning that I'm recording it. We were out of town on some vacation this week, came in last evening, and so this morning was the time I had set aside for this. This morning, the two scripture readings which both impinge on the sermon are Psalm 104 and Genesis 1, the full chapters. And these are not short readings, so I would encourage you, if you have not read them already, to turn off the video and go and read Psalm 104. If you have the Trinity hymnal at home, read it from the back of the hymnal, because the congregation will have read that same text this morning as well. And that you'll take time to read the full chapter of the first of Genesis 1, because the sermon this morning is based on those texts. I won't read them for you on the recording, simply given the length of those texts, except that I will read a few verses from the last part of the Genesis reading. Actually, our Genesis reading will carry us into chapter 2, the first 3 verses. Which is not reflected in the service layout, because those first 3 verses really go with the chapter before. But it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." This is the Sunday before Thanksgiving. It is also the Sunday on which, in our journey through the Creed, we come to that line regarding God, maker of heaven and earth. We live on a planetary island in a hostile sea of space. That's how you can describe the earth. Our Earth sits in our solar system's habitable zone, or what scientists will also call, in a way that makes more sense for the rest of us, I think, the so-called Goldilocks zone. If our planet was any closer to the sun than it is, it would be too hot for life to be able to live here. And if our planet were any further out, it would be too much of a frozen waste for life to be sustained. Like the bowl of porridge that Goldilocks ate, our placement in our solar system in relation to the sun is a place neither too hot or too cold, but just right. The Goldilocks zone. And so our Earth sits in this little strand, if you can imagine it, the strand beam around the sun, band around the sun, the stream where life has to be out of all the vastness of space. And even on our planet, when you consider life, we live in a limited zone, another band that you might say across our planet. Let me explain. If you were to go just a few miles above the earth, unprotected, you would not be able to sustain life. At 10,000 feet, you wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen to live. You would be exposed to freezing temperatures. You go higher above that into the beginnings of where our atmosphere begins to thin, then the temperatures suddenly shoot up into high numbers, and your blood would boil from the extreme heat. But in the same way, if you go just a very short distance into the earth, you will likewise be burned up from the heat coming from the core that keeps this planet alive. Even a short distance into the ground will expose you to all kinds of different gases that can take your life. Ask any coal miner Commenting on this very thing, the 20th century German theologian and preacher, by the way, Helmut Thielicke, said this: "The Creator has allotted us only a very thin band between the zone of death above and below. Here he reserves a space for us men to live, and he holds back the threatening elements of destruction at its borders." So when you think about our placement in the world, our placement in the universe, but even our placement on this planet, we live in this thin band between the zone of death above and the zone of death below. Well, when Thielicke said this in a sermon, he was reflecting the picture that we get of creation in that first chapter of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, in the first creation story, we are given a picture of our world as one where life thrives, but ever so precariously. Let me explain. Throughout the Bible, the seas, the ocean, the waters, the floods, all of that is a picture of destruction and chaos and threat to life. And you'll find that to be true from the opening chapter of the Bible all the way to the end of the Bible, where we're finally told that in the new heaven and the new earth, the sea was no more. It's a picture of the world, as it were, under constant threat. And the book of Genesis really plays with this image to emphasize the point that Thielicke makes. If you read the description of the creation in Genesis, it talks about that God had separated the waters on the surface of the earth, which are always there, ever threatening us, from the waters that are above the firmament. It's sort of a picture of a world where there is threat above and threat here below. And the only thing that keeps this world from falling in on us and destroying us for good is the hand of God. In our psalm, we get a different picture of things, but nonetheless a picture that teaches the very same message. Psalm 104:29, when you, speaking of God, when you hide your face, they, life, are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. And yet, for all the vastness of the universe, the vastness of space, for all the vastness even of this planet Earth that is not hospitable to life, we have a rich, magnificent world in this band that God has given us. Yes, God has placed us in limits, but these limits are not to be thought of in terms of some sort of a prison for us. These limits are limits for life, limits that enable us to live. And in putting us in these limits, God has acted graciously to us. Now, when you contemplate the whole thought of creation, God never needed to create us. He doesn't need us. There was no need in God to motivate him to call us and all things into being as if somehow he had to do that to be self-actualized or something. No, it is purely an act of love and an act of grace. What's more, God did not need us, he desired us. And so it was that he made us. But before he ever made us, he made a world for us. That is also one of the main messages both of Genesis and Psalm 104. He created us human beings, male and female, as the pinnacle of his creation. And that's what those two creation stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, though they tell the story in different ways, tell us that same theological point. God created the world for us, and we're the pinnacle of his creation. And yet, for all the greatness of God, so evident in his creation, we forget it. The human story is a story of wanting to be more than we are, to be more than simply a part of creation. The human story is wanting to be not a part of the creation at all, but to be God. So that being God ourselves, we might live without God in a world of our own dreaming and making. We don't want to be the clay. We want to be the potter. This is the oldest of human temptations. The great temptation even held out by the voice of the serpent to Adam and Eve, that they might be like God. Because see, if we become ourselves like God, we don't need God. In the first chapter of his letter to the church of Rome, the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul pointed this out. He described the state of mankind as a rebellion against the Creator. That despite what can be seen of the glory and might of God in creation, human beings, by their, quote, unrighteousness, suppress the truth, Paul writes. They reject the notion that there is a Creator above them. And Paul puts it so well. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And in so rejecting the Creator, they also reject the order that he built into the creation. Friends, when we forget our place in the order of things and begin to act not like creatures, not like a part of the creation, but to act like God, chaos ensues. Always, chaos follows. Paul lays this out in the latter part of that first chapter of Romans in what you might call a sin catalog, where he catalogs in a general way how this unfolds in human life. That's in Romans 1, verses 26 to 32. And if you look at that list, there is no part of our life that isn't touched by it in this rebellion against the Creator. Relationships, our social world, religion, our sexuality, all of it is affected. The most basic foundational parts of our human life become debased and marred when we forget that we are not the Creator, but we are a part of the creation. You know, there was a day, and not that many years ago, when most people in the world, much less the Western world, would grant you that whether or not they believed in the God of the Bible, they nonetheless believed that there was a God who was responsible for the creation. The notion that there was a universe without a creator was, for the most part, an unthinkable idea. It was not a plausible idea, to use some of the philosophical language, for most people to imagine. And sure, there have always been here and there atheists, but very few. And while there have always been more agnostics than atheists, they were also in a small minority of the world. Only over the years and modern times have atheism gained ground, slowly, incrementally, as people began to turn away from religion and from the religious foundations of our societies. And what has happened? What has happened in the wake of that turn will rather quickly and increasingly, 21st century people, especially in the Western world, have not only rejected the notion of a God that is a creator, but when you have eliminated the notion of God as a creator, you also eliminate the notion of there being a creation. And in rejecting the idea of a creator and a creation, many have begun to reject the notions that in creating us, God showed his mercy and his grace by placing his life-giving and life-sustaining limits upon us. And in the wake of rejecting that, a lot has happened. Dear friends, when we turn away from God, it is inevitable that we will turn away from one another. And that has happened. And that has happened in the Western world. That has happened in a rather large, systemic way in our own lifetimes. You know, for all the promise a generation ago of the sexual revolution, when the Western world decided to overthrow the repressive morality of the past, we did create an entirely different society. And as a result of that, we have a society today where fully half of the children that are born in our society are born to single mothers. And most of those children are born into poverty. Society will continue to pay the price for this so-called revolution in profound ways into the future. And in that same revolution, people weren't simply content to end at redefining what they construed morality to be. In fact, this revolution was a rejection of any kind of limits at all. And so with the breaking down of morality, we have also taken it on ourselves to declare these other inborn limits of the creation no longer apply to us either. Those developments have come upon us in the new wave of the sexual revolution, which states that the notion of male and female in any meaningful way are no longer of meaning. And so the transgender movement has been the most recent wave of this revolution. And what that means is this: increasingly in our educational system, from kindergarten, depending on where you live in this land, to university, young people are being told that their body and their birth no longer place any defining, much less life-affirming limits on who and what they are. And so they are being taught and told that even if born a biological male, a boy can grow to become a woman if he so chooses. And likewise, the child born biologically a female can choose to be, if she so chooses to, a man later in life. This has led to confusion at a level that no other human society in history could have even imagined. And so we have people today who are being denounced, people who aren't social conservatives, but well-known people who have taken a pretty progressive voice in many matters of society have been denounced and rejected as oppressing people for not willing to embrace this very kind of philosophy I'm thinking of. Look up J.K. Rowling on the internet. You will be amazed at what has happened to her. All of this has led to some proclamations that people make today that in no other time they would have ever made. Men can give birth, for example, given the transgender movement. Increasingly, the rising generation are told that they no longer have to be governed by the limits of their biology, the limits of their bodily existence. Through drugs, through surgical mutilation, which is euphemistically called gender reassignment surgery. They can determine who and what they will be for themselves. But when you contemplate what this is, it really represents a complete rejection of the idea of a creator and a created natural order. To reject these limits, friends, destroys the barriers that aren't there to imprison us. They are the barriers that are there to hold back the chaos that ensues when we reject them, like the way Genesis 1 describes that firmament, the heaven which holds back all of the threatening waters that would engulf the world. It is as if humanity has decided to dismantle the picture of the universe that we have in Genesis 1, only to have the chaos break in on us. As Christians, however, we can't and must not be silenced or cowed into submission to this way of thinking, a way of thinking that is not only, strictly speaking, godless, but really at the end of the day, creationless and thus inhuman. Dear friends, know this, for the most part, atheism, the rejection of God and thus the rejection of a creator above us and the limits of creation around us, it really isn't so much the intellectual problem that we have tried to make it. For the most part, I would say this, atheism does not flow from an intellectual struggle that people can't make sense of a notion of God, because you can eliminate the notion of God and you're still left with all sorts of philosophical and scientific conundrums afterward. Don't believe postmodern scientists when they tell you that you can't believe in science and believe in God. Dear friends, science itself is a creation of a Christian culture. It took a Christian culture in the Western world, I could even expand it and say a Judeo-Christian culture, to give us the possibilities for science, because it was the message of the Bible that God created the world in a way that reflects His order, in a way in which we can find the laws built into that order that we can actually study. And we take that notion for granted, but that notion is profoundly different than the notions that flowed out of virtually every other human religion in history. It's not so much an issue of people no longer being able to contemplate the notion of a God. It's far more the notion that people don't want there to be one. Because if there is no God, if there is no God above us, then we do not have to live under the constraints of anyone or anything, even the constraints of our own bodily existence. Let me illustrate it at perhaps an even more mundane level. The now retired Presbyterian minister who served Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, the Reverend Dr. Tim Keller, tells a story about how it was not uncommon for college students in his churches through the years to go off to college and come home after their first semester or their first year in college and want to have a meeting with him. And in this meeting, share how they were struggling with their faith and no longer knew whether they believed in God. Now let's imagine such a young man has gone to see Pastor Keller named Johnny. And he would describe the encounter like this, that Johnny would come in and tell him that he no longer knew whether he believed in God or not and was struggling with his faith. And Keller would ask a question that might strike you as a bit unnerving, but here we go. And his question would be this: Johnny, how long have you been sleeping with your girlfriend? And inevitably, Johnny would look a little embarrassed and then answer his question. What Keller's point is this: Johnny is not so much experiencing a problem born of an intellectual struggle. It was a problem born of a moral struggle. Johnny had decided that he wanted to determine things for himself and live in accordance to the way he wanted to. And in the course of that, realized that God inevitably gets in the way of such a life. Most atheism is born not of intellectual struggle. Some of it is. Most of it's born over the moral struggle. Dear friends, each week we stand and we confess we believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. This isn't an intellectually bankrupt statement to make. The most brilliant scientists in history have believed this very point. In fact, science as we know it wouldn't exist apart from a Christian worldview. And yes, there have been great scientists who have not been Christians who nonetheless believed in God. Albert Einstein was among them. Don't think that atheism is the default setting for science. It isn't. In fact, atheists, even among the scientists today, is a fairly recent thing in human history, as it is in the general population. The familiar passage we read from Genesis this morning, as well as that beautiful creation psalm 104, both passages of Scripture celebrate the boundaries and limits which God has made for the benefit of life. The psalm especially is a celebratory psalm. It celebrates these limits not as something that imprison us, but something that enables life for us and for all creation, all the animals as well, for that which grows up out of the earth. That is why this psalm is a psalm of thanksgiving. And in it we give thanks to God for the wonders of creation as a whole, but also for the wonders of those things that will probably be sitting on our tables sometime this week. He makes the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread that sustains his heart. Dear friends, let us embrace the limits of creation that God has created for us, because they are the very life-giving limits that come from his hand. And let us this week and every week give our thanks to the Lord our God, even in a trying time, even in a time of pandemic. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. For he is good, and his love endures forever. Amen.